It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby. God blasted him on the spot. Ghost. Friends, it's time for the Bible.
It's 1 a.m, and this is Robert M. Price, the Night Fly, also known as the Bible Geek in some circles, but as Gregory Bate once said, I have been known by other names in other places. So let's get to some announcements, and then some exciting Bible Geek questions. Let's see, in case you didn't know, you probably do by now, the, discussion Richard Carrier and I had about the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings is up on Wired.com, and take a look at http://www.wired.com/2014/geeks-guide-exodus/ It was loads of fun, as it always is, when the great comedy team of Carrier and Price get together, sort of like Hope and Crosby, or Abbott and Costello, maybe. Let's see, and once again, if you're interested in argumentation and critical thinking, and of course you are, you wouldn't be listening, check out Bo Bennett's new online course on logical fallacies. He, as he does in his book, he explains in detail dozens of the most common logical fallacies, how to spot them, how to avoid them, and unlike his excellent book, he has audio visuals here, and I think it would really be right up your alley if you're a geek. And we're supporting it, so you'll find it at Bible Geek, all one word, BibleGeek.masteringLogicalFallacies.com, and you can enroll there. Okay, now, who's number one today? Derek Bennett, a great fan and supporter of the show, says, I was just listening to the most recent Bible Geek episode in which you revisited Reuven's question concerning the rabbi who, quote, taught the Torah to God. The following is pure speculation, but it occurred to me that this could be a bit of historical hyperbole. I'm thinking of the way that some enthusiastic sci-fi or comic fans know their favorite material to such incredible depths and precision that it may rival or indeed surpass the memory of the creators themselves. I might say that a friend knows the Star Wars canon so well that he could teach George Lucas a thing or two and probably be correct. The same could be imagined being said of a rabbi, the potential blasphemy of the statement being the real point or weight of the hyperbole. Yes, I'm saying he understands it that well, and repeated often enough or misunderstood by someone else as a literal description, this line ends up being recorded in a biographical sketch or wherever this comes from. Just a thought. Derek, I think you're right. This didn't occur to me, but I believe you are correct. Certainly closer to the truth than the mumbo-jumbo I was spouting. Of course, why didn't I see this? The idea is, this guy knows the Torah so well he can teach God. Yeah, of course. What's the matter with me? Thank you, Derek, for clearing that up. This reminds me of a story about the great theologian Karl Barth, who was giving a seminar there in, I guess, Basel or wherever the heck he was. And there was an American student there in the seminar who was a great fan of Barth and his work and knew Barth's encyclopedic set of books, the Church Dogmatics and many others, front and back, cover to cover, and he was just a prodigy. Well, another student asked Dr. Bart what he thought about so-and-so topic, and so Karl Barth turned to this American student and said, "Yeah, so-and-so, would you give us the Barthian perspective, please? Bitte." And so the guy does. He starts out this dissertation on what Barthian theology must say on the topic. And then when he finished, Barth said, "And now I'll tell you what I think." The guy knew Barthianism better than Barth. So yeah, great theory, Derek, and I'm sure you're right. Let's see what Reuven has to say about it. And here's Reuven himself again. He says, "Hello, Dr. Price. My question concerns Hamaan from the book of Esther. In the Septuagint, the Greek, of course, version of the Old Testament, Hamaan is called a Macedonian by Xerxes in Esther 16:10. You know what he's talking about here, right? The Septuagint version has added material that the Hebrew does not have, and one reason for that is in the Hebrew book of Esther, God is never mentioned, though he's on stage, obviously, because it's the providence of God that puts everything in the works at the right time, and it's a masterpiece about that. But some thought, well, it's still not quite right. God should be mentioned, and so in the Greek version, he is. Okay, so in the Septuagint, Hamaan is called a Macedonian by Xerxes in Esther 16:10. Two explanations have been suggested by scholars. One, Macedonian was used to replace the word Mede, and emphasizes this when he also says there was no Persian blood in him. In practice, the Persians and the Medes co-ruled an empire, but there was great friction between them. Two, another opinion is that Xerxes was calling him a Macedonian spy due to his insistence on causing civil war within Persian, because the Jews and within Persia, between the Jews and the Persians. Your thoughts on this? Seems a little weird, but I'm thinking, this is totally subjective, but the first one sounds like more of a natural reading to me, especially, as you say, since it does emphasize, no Persian DNA in this guy. Well, why would you point that out? I mean, on the usual understanding in the Hebrew, it's taken for granted. Of course, he was a Jew. He wasn't a Persian. Why would you even mention that? Well, somebody just to have this here, it implies there's something dubious, something that somebody thought needed clarification, and so they're specifying that, well, he wasn't a Persian per se. He was a Mede. I'm not sure what basis there is for that or what advantage there is in it. If anything, you might think it's a way of getting the Persians off the hook, because this guy was, if it meant he was a Mede, well, at least he wasn't calling for a genocidal pogrom against Jews in the name of Persia, or at least Persians weren't doing it, even though he was trying to manipulate them into doing it. I would kind of think it might be that, perhaps because of a feeling of loyalty to Cyrus and the great anointed of the second Isaiah. My second question concerns the book of Revelation's origins. A possibility that occurred to me was an Ethiopian Jewish origin for the book. According to the book of Revelation 7:4-8, the tribe of Dan is the only tribe of Israel not included in the list of tribes that are sealed. No mention is made of why they are excluded. As many of our listeners know, the Ethiopian Jews, at least partially, are descended from the tribe of Dan. Another connection to Ethiopia is the title of the emperor throughout the Solomonic dynasty, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered, which is also found in Revelation 5:5. What do you make of this? Could Revelation have a connection to Ethiopia? I don't think so. I mean, anything's possible. I wonder if this could be invoked as a possible explanation for the poor Greek of Revelation, as if it's somebody writing in Greek when it wasn't his native language. Could be. Let's see. There is a traditional guess at the omission of Dan, and that is that, at least according to some legend, don't know where it dates from exactly, the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. If you say it was written by Phalasha Jews, Ethiopian Jews, why would they omit their own tribe? You'd think if anything they'd have more prominence. So that doesn't really click with me. Another question from Reuven. My question concerns Patach Eliyahu, which means Elijah opened. The text opens with Master of the Worlds, which immediately reminded me of the Quran. While it is very difficult to date the Zohar's texts, do you think there's a connection here to the Quran? Has Kabbalah influenced the Quran, or has the Quran influenced Kabbalah? The latter is not unreasonable, as many Jews from the medieval period were experts in Islam and Islamic law. To me, this is a little too scanty to make that look very likely, though there's nothing improbable about it, on the other hand. And it seems to me that since Islam earlier in its history was soaking up ideas and laws and the like from Judaism and Samaritanism, and then on the other hand the Kabbalah enshrines a lot of very old tradition, it could just be that they come from a common dependence upon Jewish tradition. For instance, the Quran, and somewhere in the Mishnah, I think, is the statement that God saith unto a thing, be, and it is. That's pretty good, pretty striking, and I'm guessing that the Quran got it from Judaism, but this could be another case of that. On the September 22nd, your inquirer notes that Herodotus did not mention the Hebrews or Judah, and he wonders why. Within the Persian Empire, there must have been hundreds of ethnoi, or nations, or peoples, that he did not mention. And west of Greece, there must have also been many he never heard of. His history amounts to some 500 pages. Like any historian after him, he must select from a mass of this and that what he will include and exclude. I'm just getting sleepy, not bored. Herodotus was the first source document I read in grad school when I wrote a paper for class on him, Thucydides, and Polybius. I have never read him through again, only passages, so I cannot be certain how many he mentioned and how many he did not mention, that now we know existed, and perhaps there were many neither he nor we know anything about. In a word search of the text, I found no mention of Rome or the Etruscans, nor of many peoples to the east of Hellas, which is, of course, the area of his interest and knowledge. He dealt with the political units, for the most part, that Persia conquered. Within those units, there may have been many subject peoples now known only to God. You've often said... Oh, by the way, this is Merlin who's... writing this, sorry. You've often said that the historian deals mainly with probabilities. True, at least for those who are genuine, not pseudo-historians who are certain of everything that supports their fundamentalist doctrine. The latter have grown in numbers during the last decades. I have less and less respect for the profession in which I was trained. Ooh, ouch. Yeah, I'm sure it deserves it, too. Merlin Berry. Chris Jansen in Athens, Georgia. I've been hosting a private discussion group on Facebook for people who are interested in the Gospel of Mark. It is a mix of fundamentalists, liberal Christians, and atheists. When I mentioned you, one of my fundamentalist friends, Kami Mercer, asked the following: does Mr. Robert Price believe the Bible is divinely inspired and inerrant? What is his theological stance? I suppose I could answer this for you, but I honestly would like to hear your answer to Cami, I'm sorry. We talk about so many stratospheric subjects and complex analyses. I would love to hear how you answer this sort of basic question from a believer. Well, I certainly don't believe the Bible is inerrant, without error, and I don't think there's any reason to believe it's inspired, but by God, that is, God caused it to be written, and I mean that's regardless of whether there is a God or not. I mean there might be one, and I still wouldn't think the Bible is inspired. Mainly because it's not like that claim is true or false. I think it's meaningless because given the clash of different opinions in the Bible, the apparently fictional and mythical character of most of the narrative, and the errors, it seems to me inspiration fades away to nothing. What difference does it make if the book is inspired? I mean, more liberal theologians and Bible scholars like to say, well, now, wait a minute, who are you to tell God what genres he can use? Suppose he wants to use fiction and myth, just as Jesus used parables to teach. Who are you to... I mean, if you know what God's literary tastes are, I don't think you even need the Bible. You know the mind of God already. And, you can say that, but then what does inspiration add to the mix? If you're saying, well, okay, we've got a collection of myths and legends and fictions and different opinions... you mean exactly as if plain old human beings wrote it unaided? What is the... And you could say, well, it's authoritative if it's inspired. Well, I don't see how that really helps either, because the Bible is so often ambiguous. Even if it is infallible, if you can't tell exactly what it says, it might as well be fallible. In effect, it is. I mean, you could say, well, when we get to heaven, we'll find out what all that stuff really meant. Well, in heaven, the perfect has come, the imperfect passes away. You're not going to need the Bible anymore. You'll have no problems for it to solve, and you'll have God right there to tell you everything, right? So what the heck? I mean, you need to know what the Bible says now, right, if it's a revelation that you need. So I don't think it really works. Plus, I go with Martin Luther. Inspired or not, the Bible is written by and for human beings. I mean, again, even if God inspired it, what is it he inspired? Well, human writings, something that was to be read and understood by human beings. This is why he said you have to use the grammatico-historical method. Interpret the Bible as you would any other ancient document. You've got to learn the grammar of the language and the meaning of the vocabulary and all the historical background before you can understand it. You can't start treating it like a magic book and saying, well, I don't really care what it says on the surface. It's some deeper allegorical meaning that matters. What? You can make the Bible into a ventriloquist dummy that way, as he thought medieval Catholicism had done. And so he said, no, we got to stick with a plain human way of understanding it. Now, once we do, well, of course, sola scriptura, we're going to stick with the Bible. That's where the inspiration comes in, the applicability and the authority of it. But the problem is that interpreting the Bible that way leads to the honest recognition of non-factual genres of errors and contradictions, because you see, the minute you start to hedge and say, well, maybe it doesn't really mean what it says, maybe James or Paul or somebody should have been clearer, and I bet if they had the chance to revise it, they'd have said, wait a minute, I thought it was the plain sense of the text that mattered. You can't just rewrite it to say what you wish it had said or what it should have said. You're going away from the literal interpretation then. And so I think it's self-defeating. The minute you start pulling the reins and saying, well, it can't mean so-and-so because after all it's inspired and infallible. Sorry. You've got to be straight and honest with what the text actually says and not insist that it be tailored to your theological preferences. And so I think that close scrutiny of the text certainly says it's not inerrant, and there's so many different viewpoints and ambiguities in it that it's just superfluous to say it's inspired. So that's my windy answer to that one. I hope that's productive of some good discussion. Let's see. This one is kind of long. That's all right though. Just looking for the name. John D. Not D-E-E, just the initial. I don't want you to think we have an Elizabethan sorcerer calling in, though that would be interesting. My mother likes to give me books intermittently about Christianity to help re-save my soul, and the one I'm reading right now is called Jesus on Trial by David Limbaugh. None of it is even slightly convincing, but the book does have a section on the Jesus Seminar that I would like you to comment on. Quote, but the conclusions of these critical scholars were tainted by their anti-supernatural presuppositions, which made it impossible for them to examine the evidence objectively. They even candidly admitted that they approached their study with the bias that miracles cannot happen, quote-unquote, still quoting, so that all of the supernatural events of the Gospels are rejected from the outset, and that Jesus never talked about himself or about the future or about final judgment, a topic unworthy of an enlightened teacher, end of quote. Craig Blomberg points out that these further restrictive biases precluded the idea that Jesus could have considered himself to be divine or to have predicted the future accurately and inerrantly. How's that for an academically rigorous approach? They simply agreed in advance that Jesus couldn't possibly have performed miracles, didn't claim to be God, didn't prophesy, and didn't talk of hell. Therefore, he didn't, not because he actually didn't, but because these scholars chose to view him as one who wouldn't have said or done such things. So by pseudo-academic fiat, they gutted the Gospels and the divinity of Christ. I remember learning about the Jesus Seminar back in my seeking days and thinking how disturbing its findings could be for those unfamiliar with the sophistry underlying their arguments. Blomberg reports that while there are some promising trends for the historical Jesus in modern New Testament scholarship, outside of quote, outside of distinctively evangelical circles, even in mainstream centrist New Testament scholarship, it is still by no means believed that any substantial majority of Gospels or Acts is historically accurate, end quote. Blomberg, of course, dissents from these conclusions, that is, of the Jesus Seminar, and believes that the evidence supports, quote, a substantial measure of confidence in the historical trustworthiness of all four Gospels accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts, which relates the history of the early church. Blomberg insists that in examining the evidence he has labored to avoid the error committed by the Jesus Seminar of presupposing conclusions. If we just apply the same standards used by classical historians to evaluate the historical reliability of works from the ancient church, from the ancient Jewish, Christian, let me start over again. If we just apply the same standards used by classical historians to evaluate the historical reliability of works from the ancient Jewish, Greek, and Roman worlds, Blomberg says, quote, a cumulative case emerges which suggests that the Gospels and Acts are historically reliable. Indeed, Blomberg writes, that even the most liberal members of the Jesus Seminar agree that there is no historical evidence whatsoever to support the claims of some modern-day Mormons or Muslims that the text of the New Testament became so corrupted over the centuries that we have no way of being sure what the original contained. Why are there, end of quote, why are there so many hostile accusations against the Jesus Seminar participants? They're accused of having presuppositions against the miraculous, but I've heard you state clearly that you have no bias against miracles, but that there's no way to prove them using the historical method. He acts as if the Jesus Seminar did not have any arguments for the conclusion. They claim that the original text still exists, scattered within the many variant copies, even though we have no idea what the original text looked like. I think that Blomberg is... I have to assume he means what he says, but it is so obviously wrong that I think he's just kidding himself. I've debated him, as you may know. And I've reviewed at least one of his books. The reviews contained in my book, The Historical Bejesus. He seems to me certainly to be an axe-grinding apologist who has presupposed the accuracy of the Bible. I think he's exactly the opposite of what he describes himself to be. And it just seems to, I mean, he has made harmonization into a so-called critical method. It's disgraceful. I have to view the guy as a hack, a spin doctor for well-mannered, well-dressed fundamentalism. I'm sorry to say that, but I just have to be honest about it. The Jesus Seminar is basing its approach on the methodological naturalism of science and history. They're not taking an epistemological position. We know miracles can't happen, but as you say, it's more like the principle of analogy, that there is almost by definition no probability to miracle stories, simply because they always look like acknowledged legends from the ancient world, or rumors in the modern world, not like observed, documented cases of supernatural events, of which there really aren't any anyway. And so this is just... I mean, I don't agree with everything the Jesus Seminar says either. Nobody does. They don't have unanimous votes on these things. And but it's clear to me that Limbaugh and Blomberg and these guys are just axe grinders and really unworthy of attention, I'm sorry to say. Having said that, I mean, like with Bill O'Reilly, with David Limbaugh, these guys are conservative Republicans. So am I, right? I don't think they're not my enemies, but I just think when it comes to scholarship, oh my God, forget it. I was supposed to, earlier this evening, be on Aaron Ra's show, but I typically couldn't make the connection with Google and all that stuff. I don't know, it just defies me. But we were going to be talking about, I guess he did talk about, Dennis Prager's YouTube video, which purports to show how the Ten Commandments are just the bee's knees, the greatest document ever, and that without God you have no basis for morality. And I like what Prager says usually on political matters and the state of Israel and so on. But holy mackerel, how stupid. I wish these guys had just piped down about what they obviously know nothing about. Okay, this one's from Russell Jones. Greetings from Florida. I was wondering if you could give us an update on how far along the Gospel According to Price was. The Facebook page has not been updated in a while with new information from the creators. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's really looking forward to this. Actually, I have no idea. The last thing I heard months ago was that they were trying to find other people to put on camera to critique my views, which of course they ought to do. And so I suggested Bart Ehrman and Greg Boyd, and I don't know whatever came of that, but that was the big thing holding them back at the time. I don't know where things are at now, though. I hope it comes about, but even if it doesn't, I sure had a great time in Toronto filming it. Okay, going on, Russell says, recently I was having a friendly conversation with a Christian friend about the implausibility of Noah's Ark and the flood, and a thought occurred to me that I've never considered before, and I don't believe I've ever heard it said before either. God tells Noah not only to get 7 pairs of the clean animals and 1 pair each of the unclean, the non-kosher, but also to bring all of the food necessary for the trip. Well, since God doesn't tell Noah how long they're going to be on the boat, how could he know how much food to bring? And there's no question that Noah doesn't know how long the voyage will be, because he needs to release various birds to see when dry land disappeared. Very good, sharp-eyed. My friend had to admit this was a bit of a problem, and was also surprised to see that Noah and the gang were on the ark for about a year, not 40 days and 40 nights, as is commonly believed. I pointed to the following for support. Noah entered the ark in the 600th year of his life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, Genesis 7:11 through 13. Noah left the ark on the 27th day of the 2nd month of the following year, Genesis 8:14 through 15. Therefore, assuming a lunar calendar of 360 days, Noah was on the ark for approximately 370 days. What are your thoughts on the first point, that Noah did not know how much food to bring because he didn't know how long he was going to be on the ark? Can you think of any other points that are impossible to ignore concerning the ark and the animals? Oh yeah, the whole thing is really like a fairy tale. I mean, it has a real charm, and it's a well-told tale. Actually, 2 of them. I'm sure you know the J and P versions that have been spliced together. But there's no way an ark that is a huge box-like boat could accommodate. I mean, it gives the exact dimensions, right? So we know how big it was supposed to be. There's no way such a thing could accommodate all the species of animals in the world. Of course, they didn't know about the vast majority of them. And the one other problem is that the food needed for many of the animals was many of the other animals. Also, you couldn't have you couldn't have just put the different critters in identical stalls next to one another. Like with things like the giraffe, you'd have to, as is done today, transporting them, you would have to put them into a huge leather sling to keep them from breaking their limbs in a tossing boat, etc. And what would you do with the waste and so forth? This one I hadn't thought of either. How did he know how much food to put on there? I mean, you can start coming up with ludicrous ad hoc hypotheses, which people have done. Like, well, maybe God put them all miraculously into suspended animations, like, astronauts going to another star in a science fiction story, so they didn't need to eat. Or, well, still, how could you squeeze them all in? Well, maybe God used Brainiac's shrink ray to make them into teensy little mini critters, and then expanded them once they got there. What the... Why do you do this? Why not just admit the story is not history? It's just ridiculous. I summarize some good stuff. Robert Moore's great article, The Impossible Voyage of Noah's Ark, in one chapter of my book, The Reason-Driven Life. I'd refer you to that. It's just filled with impossibilities. Because it's like a fairy tale. Jim says, after a good amount of... wait a minute. It starts here. I've heard you speak about Jesus' apocalyptic failed prophecies. After a good amount of study, I can't help but realize that Jesus was not a historical figure. But what I can't understand in the mythicist argument is why Matthew and the Gospels would put failed prophecies into Jesus' mouth if he wasn't a historical figure. I think you mentioned it once in the podcast in passing that there were already writings they couldn't just throw away. Could you please elaborate? Well, yeah, anybody reading Mark would not infer that Jesus had not been a historical figure. Mark presupposes historicization. So whether he concocted it or not is another question. Who knows? But that doesn't really matter here. Matthew and Luke would have assumed that, I guess, that Mark was telling a historical story, and if there were embarrassments there, they would do their best to sort of disguise them as they do. Like, look at what Conselman says about Luke's theology and eschatology, and Matthew, how he adds the delay motif to the parables of the coming of the kingdom. But why? And Mark apparently did the same thing. He inherited the little apocalypse, the Olivet Discourse, which predicted that the world would end as soon as the certain events came about, and that there would be no delay. Well, what the heck happened? Well, Mark apparently didn't feel at liberty to get rid of this, so he includes it, but he immediately has Jesus contradict himself by saying, but of that day and hour nobody knows. Not even the angels or the Son, only the Father. I mean, that business with the Son automatically shows it's later than the rest of the Markan material. But it's not only that. There's other changes, like Jesus says the whole generation will see this transpire at the end of Mark 13. But back in Mark 9:1, he says that only some standing there will live to see the kingdom of God come with power. What the heck is that? Well, it kind of implies that somebody's adjusting it. It wasn't the whole generation anymore. It was because most of them were dying off, and now that doesn't imply there were people. It doesn't demand that there were eyewitnesses that are now dying off. It just, though that's certainly a natural reading, don't get me wrong, but it may just mean that that people further from the scene assumed that by the projected time frame that they must all be dead, just as in 1 Corinthians 15 the author says that most of those 500 to whom Jesus appeared were still alive. He doesn't give any names, probably doesn't know them or have them in mind. It's just sort of an inference. So who knows? But all we do know is that Mark inherited a belief that a certain generation must be running out, and that few remain who would live to see the end of the age. And he doesn't say few who had seen Jesus, but rather few who would see the end of the age, right? But these, and then that didn't happen, so he reinterprets that as a few of them, though the rest were still alive, seeing the transfiguration, as if that were the coming of the kingdom. And it just seems like, and there are other aspects of Mark too that imply he was stuck with certain prophecies that apparently were made in the name of the supposed risen Jesus somewhere along the line and didn't come true. Okay. Question from Abdel Daoud, first prophet of the Aten, the sun god of Akhenaten. Now that I've broken the ice with my previous question, I have more, but some will take time to formulate. In the meantime, a few unrelated simple questions. First, my wife is a member of a Messianic congregation. Neither of us have Jewish roots, but she believes they're closer to New Testament Christianity. I sincerely doubt it, especially with what I've learned from the Geek, and the level of irrationality seems dangerously high with this group. But all I can do is try to guide her from the most extreme zealotry. Anyway, we were talking about seething a goat in its mother's milk. She claims the origin is known, contrary to what I've heard here, though without specifics. She believes the goat seething was a practice of one of the Canaanite religions, possibly a sacrificial one, and that the Israelites were explicitly forbidden from this because of its significance. Is there any evidence for this, or is it a rationalization? Well, I think actually I have been wrong that nobody had any idea, and your wife is right or close to it. Gerhard von Rad says, I'd forgotten this, recently read it again. Gerhard von Rad, in the first volume of his Old Testament theology, says that the Rosh Shamra text, the Ugaritic Canaanite texts, make it, he doesn't quote it, but he said it makes it absolutely clear that they are talking about a known ancient magic spell whereby one seethed or boiled the goat in its mother's milk, apparently to do the magical charging of it, because you would use that milk as a divination spell, as the ingredient in one. Come to think of it, it does sound sort of like that stuff, some weird treatment of some common stuff, like I think Huck Finn is told that if you swing a dead cat over your head at midnight in the cemetery 3 times, this and that'll happen. So yeah, I think that is the case. One thing I would slightly challenge, it doesn't necessarily say it was Canaanites who did it. It implies that the readers of Exodus were used to that and should cut it out, just as Isaiah condemns necromancy, going to a medium and getting her to call up the spirit of Samuel or whoever, and to tell you where they left their car keys or whatever. It assumes that Israelites were doing it and should cut it out. But yeah, I think basically she is right. Second, I've heard many times, as you've mentioned on the podcast, that there will be a grand Bible study in heaven, where the faithful will learn the hidden meanings and where all the contradictions will be resolved. But will we have asbestos-paged Bibles in hell so we can learn where we went wrong? Well, I wouldn't have thought so, but apparently in the movie Constantine, it turns out there is a version of the Bible used in hell, and it has extra material, like an added chapter in 1 Corinthians, though the idiot that wrote the thing knew nothing about the Bible, and has Constantine speak of Acts when he means chapters of the Bible, because some dullard saw a couple of numbers, colon, couple of numbers, which it means chapter and verse, but thought it meant act and scene, like in a play. It's shockingly, horrifically stupid. But at any rate, it has the idea that there are extra chapters where you find out the rest of the story. So maybe we will. Let's see. Finally, a little more seriously, but leading from that thought, you've spoken a lot about what the New Testament does and doesn't say about Hey Allah. What puzzles me a little more is how little it speaks about heaven. How much basis is there for traditional views of heaven in the Bible, beyond the 144,000 in Revelation, that is? I don't really think there's hardly any. It seems to imply that children will be there, which is a fairly obvious thing unless you're a Calvinist. It speaks of a paradise of the just and the repentant, as when Jesus says to the man on the cross next to him, "Today you shall be with me in paradise." Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, he knew a man who 14 years ago ascended into paradise, the third heaven. But what goes on there? We are told on several occasions that Jehovah meets with his council of celestial advisors to plan and so on. Second Kings, the book of Job, and so on, the Psalms. But as to what role humans have, doesn't exactly say in Revelation. It says that the souls of the martyrs are under the Ark of the Covenant in heaven, implying that they died as sacrifices, and that they're going to be vindicated. But very little. I mean, it says no marriage in heaven. But it's like it's not as anthropomorphic as it's often made. I mean, there's some really comical descriptions of heaven by theologians who should have known better. I kind of like what Friedrich Schleiermacher said, that it almost sounds like a Buddhist, that given the necessary complete changeover of conditions, I mean, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, right? In 1 Corinthians 15, you're not going to be raised from the dead with the same old human body. You die all over again, right? You get old and sick and die. No, the resurrection is supposed to be freedom from that. So what would it be? Well, he can't say much. He says, well, just like the different sorts of heavenly bodies, some stars and planets that differ from one another in magnitude, there's different sorts of corporeal bodies. That ours is buried, an earthly body, but rises a celestial or spiritual body. But he doesn't presume to say what that is. I mean, now we see in a glass darkly. That's very much like a Buddhist parable where somebody asks the Buddha what nirvana is like, and he says, well, let me give you a parable. This tadpole asks his father, he's still swimming around with his tail and all that, and he says, Dad, what's it like out there breathing air? What's the dry land like? And the Papa Frog thinks for a minute and says, gee, son, I can't really tell you. You're just going to have to become a frog and find out for yourself, because every word you speak is predicated on a water world. I don't think there's any terms that you would know that would make sense that I could use to describe the world of dry land. You'll see it, but you'll have to get into that position, and until you do, whatever I say will be meaningless. Yeah, that's what Schleiermacher says basically, and surely it would be true. I once did some article, imagine there's a heaven, not so easy if you try. Because, you're going to be there with all of your ancestors and relatives. How many of them? I mean, everybody's related to everybody else. You're going to have a family reunion in heaven with Ook, the caveman, showing up. She's riding his woolly mammoth. I mean, it just gets kind of ridiculous. But that's the idea that in 1 Corinthians 13, now we see in a glass darkly. How could we know or even grasp those things? Makes some sense. I love Mr. Scott's rendition of Amazing Grace at Spock's funeral, but really 10,000 years of hymn singing followed by an infinity of 10,000 years of the same? How can anyone believe that a human was made for that, even symbolically? Again, the idea when we've been there 1,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Isn't that going to get a little tiresome after a while? Again, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It just automatically becomes metaphor when you think of beings like us being with God in eternity. It just is totally contradictory. But again, many religious thinkers have admitted that. And I've said, yeah, of course it's absurd if you say the only thing you can say, a kind of a metaphor. We'd be fools to think we could understand what the afterlife could be. That doesn't mean there isn't one. In fact, it'd be pretty disappointing if it were something we could explain. Like, I love this old cartoon I saw, these two guys wearing dingy sheets and sporting bent wire halos over their head. They're in a room with cracked plaster. They're sitting on a splitting naugahyde couch. The only illumination comes from a naked bulb coming out of the ceiling. And on the wall there's a tilted plaque that says heaven. And one of the guys says to the other, "You know, somehow I always thought it would be classier than this." Well, D.Z. Phillips points out, just how classy would it have to be to meet your expectation of heaven? I mean, the way he put it was, suppose a Viking on the battlefield loses consciousness, and he wakes up at a huge feasting table in a vast dining hall. I kind of think of the one at West Point Academy, which is mighty impressive, let me tell you. How fancy would it have to be for the Viking to believe he had died and gone to Valhalla? You would, given the vaguely grand way we think of these things, wouldn't any concrete outcome seem disappointing? I mean, Pat Robertson, it's said, wanted to send a camera crew over to Mount Zion to film the Second Coming when events were getting pretty hot over in the Middle East. What would you expect to see? I mean, people, 700 Club viewers at home, suppose they really do get this on film, and they're watching this. Would they believe that this was the Second Coming, or would they say, this has got to be some kind of a special effects thing? Well, Philip's point was, you may think you believe some of these things literally, but I bet you don't. Nothing could measure up to the vague notion that you kind of expect. Very interesting point. And Abdel Daoud, first prophet of the Aten, says, "May the black sun forever curse you with wisdom." Oh, yeah. Jorby says, "I'm listening to a debate between Dan Barker and Douglas Wilson. 'Thou shalt not kill' was brought up, and it made me wonder, could this also be a commandment to be vegetarian? Are Christian slaughterhouse workers and anyone else who kills an animal in violation of that commandment?" I don't think so, because there's really no evidence that anybody but like sectarians like the Pythagoreans were vegetarians in the ancient world. I guess the Essenes and all that, but the Ten Commandments are aimed at they're like a partial blueprint of what the ideal Jewish commonwealth would be like. And it's a little hard to imagine that they figured the rank and file would be embrace ahimsa like in Hinduism. I mean, it could be, but the word used, it's impossible to tell what they meant unless you have instances of it used in context that tell you something. And most of the time this particular word for killing is used in the Old Testament. It seems to mean unjust killing of human beings, and thus it's translated today usually as murder. It's a little hard to imagine that this was written in a context in which wars were not envisioned, or self-defense. So I don't think so. Now, what Albert Schweitzer would say is, well, that may not be what they intended, but once you have the principle in your head, why not extend to a universal reverence for life? It's kind of the way, if you could, like the way anti-abortionists take "thou shalt not murder or kill" to condemn abortion. They know, I hope, sometimes they don't seem to, that the Bible doesn't actually mention abortion. There are some early Christian works that roundly condemn it, but I don't believe it occurs per se in the Bible, not explicitly. And they're drawing an inference. Well, we think this would qualify as murder, and if we're right, the Bible would be against it. But yeah, that would be an inference, and so would this, I think, or an extension of the principle. I guess that only really matters if you're looking at the Bible as a kind of an authoritative code that you're going to be in big trouble if you bungle or disobey. Let's see. I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure to meet Dan Barker, but he is the sweetest tempered man, and is full of compassion, though once he gets into debates and so on, he's a real scrapper. But a brilliant man with fascinating experiences as an ex-evangelist and so forth. Let's see, shall I take a crack at one more? Okay, why not? For you, oh boy, I'm sorry. Who wrote this? Oh, darn, I don't seem to have the name. Oh, yeah, here we go. From Real Imaginary, also known as Norman Osborn's appointed agent. Yeah, I like Norman Osborn, the Iron Patriot. For years I've been searching for a word that defines what is beyond describable within the bounds of reason and language. Recently I ran across the term apophatic, A-P-O-P-H-A-T-I-C, upon reading a fictitious encounter between an individual who is pragmatic by nature and Socrates, who has become notorious for questioning poets and orators, including Euthyphro, about the essence of their words and then tormenting them for not being able to elaborate. Not about to be cornered, when Socrates initiates his line of questioning, the individual immediately informs Socrates that though he might not give a definition of a concept to his liking, he nonetheless knows it when he sees it. As for the more abstract principles, the individual, again, not about to be cornered, uses apophatic reasoning, where the process of negation is incurred, whereupon the description of an item is not so much contingent upon what it is, but what it isn't. I can almost hear Forrest Gump say, "Even if I did not know what love is, I still know what it isn't." Yeah. Never seen that movie. As for the discovered item, discovered term, apophatic, I found that it also is used in theology that attempts to describe God not in terms of what he is, but what he isn't, and to negate any misconceptions regarding the divine. Thus, apophatic theology is also referred to as negative theology. Earlier expositors of themes aligned with it include Tertullian and Aquinas. Contemporary ones include Karen Armstrong, who, according to Wikipedia, quote, in her book The Case for God, 2009, notices a recovery of apophatic theology in postmodern theology, end quote. As I read any comparisons between negative, what God isn't, theology, and what is referred to as positive, what God is, theology, I see a Mary versus Martha duality that exists as two sides of the same coin, and I wish that King Solomon would split the piece right through the rounded edge and leave us with a better half. Knowing of your background in systematic theology and deconstruction, I am curious to hear what is your take on apophatic or negative theology. Well, one thing I was thinking as I was reading that was underlying deconstruction is Ferdinand Saussure's understanding of linguistics. He says that words do not refer to things like a label on a bottle, though that's usually what we think. He says, no, the meaning of words is not based on reference, but difference. Words are taken to mean A because they are not B or C. It's like jigsaw puzzle pieces. Their shape is completely determined by the shape of the other pieces adjacent to them, and so that there is no signifier beyond the ricocheting field of echoes that we call language and speech. And language refers to other language ultimately and nothing beyond. And for instance, whenever somebody says, what do you mean by apophatic theology, or what do you mean by deconstruction? The only way to proceed is to use more words. And then you have to say, now, what do you mean by that? And so on and so on. And we keep defining words with words. It's like an extreme example would be when you look up a word in the dictionary and it just gives you another version of it. Destruction. Well, that's what happens when you destroy. Well, what does destroy mean? Well, when you cause destruction. Great, thanks. So all language kind of boils down to that. And that means the definition of something is determined by what it is not. That is, the difference of this term from other adjacent ones. Okay, here's a piece of what? Fruit, vegetable, legume? Well, you define those by their distinctives, like what they do not have in common with the other possible categories. Okay, it's a fruit. Now, which kind of fruit? Well, I distinguish an apple by its differences from an orange and a banana and so forth. So language itself turns out to be apophatic. The fact that there is no transcendental signifier, according to Saussure and Derrida and so on, means that all reality is apophatic. There is a fundamental instability in language that makes it impossible for there to be a one-to-one correspondence between a word and anything. I think Zen Buddhism would say that too. And so some think this opens, the Derrida and deconstruction open the door to apophatic theology. Okay, all they're doing is to clear away oversimplistic and idolatrous theism. They're forcing a wedge between the metaphor and that to which it supposedly points. Because we have to keep that in mind, as Karl Barth said, or we will make an idol of God and Jesus Christ and so forth. We have to realize that the true God, nothing can be said to describe him except that God, put him in quotes, is being itself. Everything else, including the word God, is a symbol for God. Fascinating. Well, I beg to differ a little bit on that. I think deconstruction tends more the direction of Zen, where the idea is that all we can say about reality, if we even want to use that word, is sunyata, the void, or tathata, suchness, like a lunar surface on which there is no air, only dust and craters. That ultimately one can have raw experience in like a satori state, as Buddhism calls it, but language will not touch it. It will be a mystical state of unity. In fact, the last few decades, a study about what happens in the brain when people have mystical transcendent experiences. That lines up real well with Buddhism, more so than with Hinduism, where they say a mystic is experiencing the ultimate reality. Well, Buddhism says there is no ultimate reality, though there is experience. And so if you find that these mystical states are the product of brain chemistry, no problem with that, according to Buddhism. It's experience anyway, all the way down. But apophatic theology is a little bit different in that it posits, that's much more like Hinduism. In fact, I think it is very much like non-dualist Vedanta Hinduism, the big slogan of which in the Upanishads is neti, neti, not this, not this. Or as we would say, not this, not that. What is the Atman? Yajnavalkya asks his son, and he gives him an idea. It's, no. It's one thing he says is that thou art, And then he says, neti. It isn't any particular thing. It is no thing. Just like Tillich says, it's absurd and blasphemous to say that God exists, because that means he's a thing of some kind. It's beyond existence. Holy mackerel, what a headache that is. Apophatic theology seems to me to be saying something like that the divine is like Brahman without qualities. One cannot define it, because define is based on the word finite or finis, right? If you can define something, you can draw the boundary markers, so you can say, well, it's really like this, not like that. But if you're talking about the absolute, the universal, the eternal, the infinite, you can't define that in any way. And that's where apophatic theology, the via negativa, comes in. You're saying, look, if you're going to say these things like eternal and infinite, you can't describe God. You can only hope to experience God, and all the words you say are just in the service of that, trying to make it clear that the words are not God. You have to get beyond the words, as when Jesus says, I am the way. He's not the destination, he's the way. The Zen statement, if you ask me where the moon is and I point to it up in the sky and you think my pointing hand is the moon, you're really messed up. Or Jesus says to his disciples, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. Keep looking. Right? And so what we're trying to do in apophatic theology is to, as you say, dismiss false concepts of God, which kind of means all concepts of God. Again, very much like Zen. That the great Christological creeds are apophatic. They never claimed they were giving you a true concept by saying that Christ is one person with two natures. How are you going to explain that? Or the Trinity, one essence, three persons. People scoff and mock and say that's a lot of nonsense. You'd fail an arithmetic exam with that kind of thing. No, these guys, give them some credit, right? They said no human mind can understand this. The things we condemn as heresies are oversimplifications. People say, no, wait a minute, it's got to make some sense. Maybe there are three gods. No, there's just one God who shows himself in three different ways. Yeah, that's the ticket. And the Orthodox Christology says, no, it's not that simple. And if you think it is, you're making an idol. You're whittling down the inconceivable God into some little idol, cognitive idol that you can carry around and say, I understand this, I got it. No, you don't. And so they're trying to set up markers to stop oversimplification. I think that's, again, you got to give them some credit for that. Now, my answer to that is, I am not willing to say, yes, I have to bow in the presence of this holy mystery. Again, the notion is not absurd. If you're talking about an infinite, eternal God, you couldn't possibly understand it. Right, I can understand that. I mean, you got to have some intellectual humility. But is there any reason to think that? And that's where I respectfully dissent. I don't feel the need to say, I guess it must be a mystery, when it's much easier to explain our being stuck with this by saying it's just a bad theory, and they're hiding behind the word mystery for it. But again, that's my suspicion. I'm not trying to ridicule anybody. You have to have respect for what you're taking seriously enough to debate. Don't be glib, you just show yourself to be a fool. Let's see. So you're really aiming at an experience of God, and in fact, that's good to do these deconstructions and debunking of facile statements about God, because if you don't, you will begin to take your theology and your God language as an idol. And so Tillich said what you have to do is to do this delicate dance back and forth. If God is so abstract, there's no way to touch God or, to experience, to talk about God, so you have to use metaphors. But you always have to keep in mind that's all you're doing. Now, I don't know that that makes any sense, really. If it's that different, how could you have a symbol for it? But that's another issue. But that's what I would say about that. It's quite a fascinating business. Logan Mihei, I'm sure there's some familiar way of saying this that I'm not recognizing. M-I-H-A-Y. Sorry, Logan. I recently watched the debate between yourself and Dr. White, James White, which was fascinating, probably the best debate in regards to the truth of the Bible I've seen. Being in full agreement with you on many of your ideas, it is difficult to split hairs on a singular statement you made during the debate, but I must. You said Matthew 16:24 was added later, that is, Jesus didn't say it even if there was a Jesus, because there's no way the disciples would have known what that statement meant. This is, if anyone would be my disciple, let him take up his cross and follow me. I agree it would be an absurd statement by Jesus without any prior knowledge of the inevitable crucifixion. However, couldn't one argue that this was a prophetic statement? Just wondering how you would respond to this criticism of your argument. Well, that doesn't really help, because they plainly don't expect him to die, and or when Jesus says it bluntly, Peter says, "God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And then when he is arrested, they split and fly away like a bunch of disturbed pigeons. Right? They don't seem to expect it, and given that this is a summons to discipleship, like, this isn't one of those passion predictions where he says the Son of Man has to be handed over to the Gentiles and they'll spit on him and beat him and finally kill him, but he'll rise from the dead. Right? This isn't a prophecy. It takes for granted that, and he's speaking to the crowd, mind you, where, they know nothing about what's supposed to happen to Jesus. He hasn't told them. So what's he talking about? I mean, it seems to take for granted that, well, yeah, we know Jesus went the way of the cross, and, ooh, man, I have to as well if I'm going to sign up. 1 Peter, don't be surprised when suffering comes upon you because you're a Christian. Jesus left these footsteps for you to follow. I mean, it's clear in 1 Peter. Yeah, we know what happened to Jesus, all right, gulp. That's the same thing that's taken for granted and the same sentiment based on it that you find in that passage in Matthew. And similar ones, parallels in Mark and Luke. And it seems to me that, this is just got to be a later statement that presupposes knowledge that Jesus has gone to the cross. Oh, let me see. I guess I'll have to leave it at that for this exciting episode of the Bible Geek. Let me just tell you again, as I did on Facebook, that my new edition of the New Testament, the Human Bible New Testament, is now available. In about a week you can get it off Amazon for 25 smackers, but I'll send you an autographed one now. I have them in hand for 20, and that'll include postage, so don't add anything for that. And just PayPal me the bucks at my regular email address, criticus@aol.com. That is criticus@aol.com. And be sure you give me your mailing address, and I'll send it right to you. This is half of my pre-Nicene New Testament, just the standard canon. I have a different introductory essay. I dropped some of the essays that were in the big one. I include, as I say, only the 27, and I've revised the translations and have some new notes. And this is a big fat paperback. It's not the cinder block that the old one was. might have fun comparing them. Okay, so I'll see you pretty soon again on the Bible Geek. It's 1 in the morning, and this is Robert M. Price, the Night Fly, also known as the Bible Geek in some circles, but as Gregory Bate once said, I have been known by other names in other places. So let's get to some announcements, and then some exciting Bible Geek questions. Let's see, in case you didn't know, you probably do by now, the, discussion Richard Carrier and I had about the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings is up on Wired.com, and take a look at http://www.wired.com/2014/geeks-guide-exodus/. It was loads of fun, as it always is, when the great comedy team of Carrier and Price get together, sort of like
The Bible Geek was recorded by Robert M. Price and produced by John Felix and Sergeant Jovanovich. Theme song by John Morris. Visit us at robertmprice.mindvendor.com for more info on Robert's projects, purchase Bible Geek merchandise, and click the ever-important Donate button. Send your questions to criticus@aol.com, and be sure to rate and review The Bible Geek on iTunes. Thanks for listening to The Bible Geek. I'm Torrin Atkinson.